Recently, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Christopher Luxon, described health and safety regulations as broken and indicative of a pervasive culture of saying no that hampers economic growth.
And I think our broken health and safety rules layer on costs, they slow down activity, and often without making Kiwis any safer.
Those of you who've had the misfortune to encounter me before may have heard me talk about context. You know, that thing that helps us understand our place in the world. If we want to know where to go next, it's good to have a decent idea where we are now. Otherwise, we're all just stumbling around in the dark, trying not to fall into a ditch. So let's have a look at the history of health and safety legislation in New Zealand and see if we can find out how we ended up with this supposedly broken system. This is the Vimes Consulting Unreliable Guide to the History of Health and Safety in New Zealand, with me, Mick Bates. I'm a health and safety consultant and endlessly fallible hairless ape. This impressively mustachioed chap is William Pember Reeves. He was the Minister of Labour from 1891 to 1896. You may have heard of him as the author of The Long White Cloud, Aotearoa, which was published in 1898, which I am reliably informed is a New Zealand classic. In this particular story, though, he is the seed that started it all, probably the key figure at the start of New Zealand's health and safety regulatory journey, and responsible for shaping pioneering social and labour legislation. Yes, you did hear that right, pioneering. The New Zealand Act was, at the time, considered ahead of similar legislation, even the UK's, up the Empire. Mr. Reeves, the Honourable Member for Christchurch, is credited with the creation of two significant new pieces of legislation. The Factories Act of 1891 introduced regulations on working conditions, child labour and workplace health and safety, as well as introducing factory inspections. Once this was sorted, he went on to introduce the snappily named Industrial Consolidation and Arbitration Act of 1894. This groundbreaking law established a system for resolving industrial disputes through arbitration, making New Zealand a global leader in labour relations. He also advocated for shorter working hours, improved conditions for women and children, and broader social equity. So, at the start of the 20th century, New Zealand was world-leading in its progressive approach to worker safety and worker rights. This created groundwork for the Worker Compensation Act of 1900, which for the first time attempted to support people who were injured at work. Legislation related to mining and various amendments and political fiddling followed, but it wasn't really until after the Second World War that things picked up pace.
Now the start of their testing event, the 50 kilometres road walk. A big field got a rousing send-off as they prepared to leave the stadium and move up the Olympic way. The opening stage of a walk of over...
The post-war era saw an increase in economic activity and highlighted the need to update the work done already. 1956 saw the introduction of an updated Workers' Compensation Act, which extended coverage to more workers and attempted to make the claims process more efficient. How efficient it was, it's difficult to tell, but my guess is not very. As in 1967, the national government of the time, specifically Tom Shand, established a Royal Commission of Inquiry into the compensation for personal injury in New Zealand. Commonly known as the Woodhouse Report, it raised concerns with the fairness, equity, and notably efficiency of the current approach, and by 1972 the Accident Compensation Act had been developed. Critically, it was designed as a no-fault system. It also embedded the word accident into the New Zealand psyche. The benefits of universal cover are apparent, however, this approach was also considered an economic win for the country as it would remove litigation costs, saving organisations from the expense and, importantly, the public scrutiny into general workplace safety. While some minor changes and industry-specific regulations were developed in the subsequent years, it wasn't until 1992 that the Health and Safety and Employment Act appeared. The Woodhouse Report had cast doubt over the effectiveness of health and safety legislation. And the growing divergence of safety performance between New Zealand, when compared to the likes of Australia and the UK, had created social and therefore political awareness. This was against a background of general political reform. It was being undertaken by successive Labour and national governments. Both sides of Parliament were pushing for a more decentralised and self-regulating approach. This gave the national government under Jim Bolger the ability to redesign several key pieces of legislation with this in mind. The 1992 Act was designed to simplify what had come before and, while based on UK legislation, differed in a few significant ways. While the UK legislation was developed with strong union involvement, which positively influenced the Act's design, clarity and enforcement principles, New Zealand chose a slightly different path. In good old NZ, the focus was on economic growth, and it was felt that the responsibility for managing workplace safety should be placed squarely on the shoulders of the businesses. William, Bill to his friends, Birch was the central player in shaping the new Act. It's also worth noting that the Right Honourable Bill Birch was also the architect of the Employment Contracts Act of 1991, which resulted in the dismantling of collective bargaining and significantly weakened the power of employment unions. This move significantly moved the balance of power away from workers and towards the employers, and raised criticism at the time that it would create greater inequity and reduce job security, especially for low-paid workers who were often those most at risk. When the Health and Safety and Employment Act was introduced in early 1993, the Department of Labour, also under the control of Bill Birch, was put in charge of making sure that everyone followed the rules. The general approach of the Department of Labour was, shall we say, on the gentler end of the spectrum, with very few technical experts and a reliance on generalists' ability to work across a wide range of high-risk sectors. High-risk industries raised concerns soon after the Act came into force, and by the early 2000s an underfunded regulator was struggling. By 2009 there were only 55 inspectors to cover all sectors. The approach taken in health and safety was preempted by changes to things like building regulations, which were enacted only a year before. Deregulation, lack of inspectors, lack of technical oversight led to houses being built that were not as resistant to water falling from the sky as was hoped. It would become clear that houses weren't the only things with holes that would create lasting issues that would impact the lives of many. 29 people lost their lives at the Pike River mine on the west coast of New Zealand. The resulting public outcry over the lack of accountability for the owners of high-risk organisations forced the issue of workplace safety back into Parliament. A Royal Commission and the Health and Safety Task Force review found, in their view, the legislation wasn't fit for purpose and significant changes were needed. New legislation was developed based on UK and Australian law, but this time it did include input from groups, from unions, from workers, industry experts. What was developed moved us from hazard identification to risk management and clarified, to a degree, who was responsible for ensuring people were doing what they said they were doing. It did rely on the Australian model, though, and whereas the UK imposes a general duty of care on employers to ensure the health and safety of employees, contractors and the public affected by their operations, New Zealand, like Australia, decided it would introduce the concept of persons conducting a business or undertaking, which would, in principle, give the law greater coverage, and which is more suitable for the current complex operating environment that many businesses now face. So, what happened to safety? To use a favourite word of politicians, was it supercharged? Well, as it happened, no. Its impact has been limited, and if we're honest with ourselves, we should have expected this to be the case. The original UK Health and Safety at Work Act, and to a lesser degree the Australian equivalent, were both developed in a time where things were just slower. We allowed new ideas to emerge and be supported. There was no 24-hour news cycle or constant spotlight on failures, and there definitely wasn't a 3-year political term where any sign of indecision or compassion in the government was seen as weakness. The workplace risks are constantly changing, and experts are popping up all over the place to proclaim they know what you should be doing. It's like a very dull game of whack-a-mole, each new mole presenting their hot takes on what is wrong and how they can fix it, only to be bashed down by the next influencer, rehashing an old idea based on their extensive artificial intelligence research. New Zealand legislation has never had time to build relations with unions and other influential groups, nor to build the vast amount of knowledge and experiment with approaches that you need to solve complex problems. Not since the Factories Act of the early 1980s has legislation been developed because it was the right thing to do, rather than being a response to a crisis or an attempt to promote a particular political agenda. So that brings us back to now. According to those we have voted to govern this fine nation, we have a broken system that needs fixing. Therefore, I can only assume that the law is too complex and it needs to be simple. But wasn't that what we did in the 1990s?
Deja vu.
Look, if everyone wants to go back to the approach developed in 1992, which, remember, was designed for NZ's unique business landscape by a government promoting deregulation leading to an economic growth agenda, who am I to say that is wrong? It didn't work last time, but maybe this time it'll be different. There is a final thing worth looking at, though. Legislation changes for many reasons. Changes due to the changing social acceptances. It changes due to increased knowledge through experience. It even sometimes changes on the whim of an individual with too much power and not enough accountability. The question is, can you have legislation to stop people from getting hurt at work, which would also allow for more growth and freedom for organisations? And is that even necessary? What I mean is, does meaningful legislation restrict growth? I'm no economic expert. However, from what I can find, there has been no noticeable impact on GDP related to health and safety legislation. There has been no noticeable correlation with incident rates either. GDP appears to react to what's happening across the world, and incident rates in general over time are falling, or at worst, plateauing. Now, a drop in incident rates could well have more to do with the type of work people are doing. That would have more impact than any legislation or any health and safety professional might have. It should also be noted there's no correlation between the number of traffic cones and incident rates, or prime ministers and GDP performance for that matter. So what do we do now? Well, we could decide to have a frank conversation about what reasonably practicable means, and the level of investment necessary to meet that, let's not forget, very high standard. It might also be worth looking at the language we use. A person conducting a business or undertaking might have sounded marvellous to those sitting in a room writing the legislation, but I'm not really sure it means anything to the vast majority of the working population. Risk management and critical control development may be ultimately what we want organisations to do, but having safety measures related to your work seems a more straightforward concept for most of us to grasp. But nothing is broken. This need to assert authority through change is failing everyone, and not just in relation to safety. Change is necessary and will emerge given the right conditions. Telling everyone something is broken without accepting how it got that way means we just start the cycle again. Traffic cones are just a tool politicians use. They like to use them to seem like they know what real life is like. None of us like being stuck in traffic. I'd rather be on a train any day. But it's an easy thing to get people angry about. It's a lazy, tired argument that does nothing but create a more effective barrier than the cones themselves ever could. Whatever happens to the legislation really shouldn't make any difference, though. Organisations' approach to managing risk should be consistent. We should be making sure that people have a job they are allowed to do in a way that enables them to not only be safe, but feel safe. That'll give the companies the returns that them and the politicians so crave. You never know. Might even mean we see fewer bloody cones.